The briefing is brought to you in association with Spain. From the wilds of the Atlantic to the warmth of Mediterranean isles, the Spanish coast has something for every occasion. And whether chartering a yacht or renting a more modest motorboat, there's no better way to explore this magical country's lesser-known highlights than from the open water. Listen out for a new summer season of The Concierge on Monocle Radio. Join Robert Bound and friends as they turn navigator for an unforgettable journey along the Spanish coast. From hidden gems to legendary gastronomy, and with the unique drama of the America's Cup in the host city of Barcelona added to the mix, discover why the time is right to take to the waves. The Concierge, returning to Monocle Radio in July. This summer, set sail for Spain.
You're listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 9th of July 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, coming to you live from Studio 1 here at Midori House in London. I'm Vincent McAviney. Coming up on today's programme.
Directing attacks against civilian and civilian objects is prohibited by international humanitarian law, and any such attacks are unacceptable and must end immediately.
Ukraine observes a day of national mourning after the deadliest Russian bombardment in months. Then... Departing NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg throws the first pitch at a baseball game in Washington, D.C. But will there be cheers at the end of the NATO 75th anniversary summit? Plus, a business roundup, and Greece bucks the trend for a 4-day working week. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Vincent McAviney. First to Ukraine, which is observing a day of mourning after dozens of missiles fired by Russia struck a number of cities across the country, killing at least 43 people and wounding more than 190. One of the targets was a children's hospital and maternity unit. With me in the studio is Aliona Hilivko, former regional Ukrainian MP and the managing director of the Henry Jackson Society, a foreign policy think tank that advocates for liberal democracy, the rule of law and the market economy. Aliona, this was the deadliest day in Ukraine for some time.
Indeed, a very difficult day for all Ukrainians across the world. We have seen the biggest hospital in Ukraine that treats terminal diseases, very difficult illnesses of children, including cancer, heart diseases, and children from all over the country go there for the last chance to survive. So it was so painful to see them covered in blood and glass and from the blasted windows, and doctors telling the stories about how they try to cover the children's bodies on the surgery table with their own.
And those doctors went from giving life-saving treatment to having to do emergency evacuations.
Indeed. We don't know how many lives were lost just because those surgeries were interrupted or the treatments were interrupted, but I'm sure that that number will be announced soon. But as you've mentioned, 43 dead so far, 3 of them are children. So it's a very tragic day for Ukraine, and hopefully it's very sad that we need those days now to make the world look again and remember that actually there's still a war in Ukraine.
Well, targeting a hospital where children are receiving, life treatment for cancer and particularly life-threatening conditions is particularly egregious in an already callous war. Why would Russia do this just as NATO leaders are set to gather in Washington, D.C.?
Russia, probably as any psychopathic tendency, has this thirst for blood and an incredible desire to put the Ukrainian nation to its knees, send a relevant message to the West. I think it's especially cynical For Kremlin to do that right after Hungarian Prime Minister's visit to Kremlin and to China, just saying that, yes, you all can come and bow down to me, but there's no way that I'm stopping this war, and I will make those people pay. It is effectively a genocidal war on the Ukrainian nation. I think that has been proven time and time again, but it's finally time for the United Nations to react and for the international community to actually make some robust decisions.
The new British Defence Secretary was in fact visiting Odessa yesterday, and I think shelling there meant that he had to flee into a bunker as well. Is there sort of relief that the Labour government that's come in here in the UK, with the UK having been a real leader in Europe on support for Ukraine, that they have been sort of lockstep with what the outgoing Conservatives have said and promised for Ukraine?
It's great that John Healey was indeed in Ukraine, that he had, as dangerous as the situation was, of course, you wouldn't wish that upon anyone. But to see the attacks and what Ukrainians have to go through every day in real time. Of course, John Healey has been to Ukraine previously, but I'm not sure whether he's experienced such brutal attacks personally. It would, of course, be great to also see Foreign Minister go to Ukraine. He, on the other hand, went to Germany, Sweden, and Poland, so didn't get that far like his previous conservative predecessors. But I hope that they just have a lot on their plate and it doesn't really mean anything in diplomatic language. And of course, we will be expecting the Prime Minister, Sir Keir Starmer, visiting Ukraine sometime soon.
Now, this NATO meeting, which Keir Starmer will be going to, and David Lammy, the new UK Foreign Secretary, and also leaders of all the NATO nations, what are you hoping comes out of it? What are the big requests from President Zelensky at this time?
For Ukraine, it always has been and it always will be the NATO membership, because no security guarantees, no bilateral agreements that have been signed with G7 and NATO members in the last few months, none of that actually guarantees Ukraine's security, just like Ukrainians have unfortunately learned from the Budapest Memorandum that guaranteed some kind of security in return for Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. So unfortunately, there is a fatigue in Ukraine that's growing of the West's uncertainty and ambivalence towards Ukraine. And the only thing that could solve that is actual NATO membership. Now, we understand that while the country is at war, that would literally drag all of the members into war too. But I think it's time to ask the uncomfortable question of all the Western allies. While Ukraine is fighting for Europe, most of the European states are member states of NATO. So Ukraine is fighting for those NATO states already. When will finally come the time when they brave up and raise up to the opportunity of actually defending its eastern flank and defending the east of Europe? Because the war will come to the west if the east falls.
And it's, 2.5 years coming up into this war. It's less just about the armaments, isn't it? And it's more about manpower, because an entire generation of Ukrainians have fought this battle. Some of them have died, some of them have been injured, some of them will carry long-term mental scars, which means that someday when there is peace, it's going to echo for a long time. What would be tangible? Do they need this week to allow Ukraine to use weapons in different ways to sort of directly strike Russia? What would be a turning point moment now?
I think you're absolutely right. Ukrainians are getting really tired of the war. And as someone who's got brother on the front line for 2 years now, I can hear it in his voice. I can see it in his resolve that the 2 years of war and facing the atrocities, it does take its toll on human soul, if nothing else. But there are 40 million of us. And I'm sure that for as long as the fight continues, Ukrainians will fight. Because as you may have seen, even from reporting from the hospital scene yesterday, people were singing resilience songs and national anthems just to withstand that. But in practical terms, what Ukraine needs is A, air defense, to be able to protect the civilian population from genocidal attacks from Russia, and B, of course, more long-range weapons. And we have been forced into an asymmetrical war with Russia, where Russia can strike as deep as it wants to into Ukrainian territory, even going as far as the Western NATO states, Poland and Romania. We saw missiles landing there already. We need to be able to do the same targeting Russian airfields, ammunition depots, even deeper into Russian territory, because that's where all those planes who then kill and bomb Ukrainian civilians and children, that's where they take off from.
Mm-hmm. And just finally, how concerned are Ukrainians that a Trump presidency, something NATO is clearly trying to do contingency planning for, and the EU as well, how concerned are you that, given what's happening now with question marks over Joe Biden, that his return could scupper the war effort?
I'm listening very carefully to recent statements, interviews and publications of potential Trump advisors, whoever are rumored to take the place of his national security advisors or foreign policy officials. They all try to sound as if they're taking the realist position in political science, meaning that, right, Ukraine cannot win this war, so we need to lead to negotiations, and Trump would be the person to do it because he's the negotiator, right? I feel like that realism is more triumphalism and fatalism, if anything, because I think all of those people disregard what the world has seen in the last 2 years, that Ukrainians simply will not give up that easily. And as President Zelensky recently said in one of his interviews, if Trump's got a plan, he needs to come talk to us, to Ukrainians, because there's, again, 40 million of this nation that simply will not go with one man's decision. So I guess we're looking forward to seeing how the campaign unfolds. It's the choice of the American people and them alone. And we will deal with what we have to deal when it comes to it.
Aliona, thank you. That was Aliona Hilivko. Now here's Monocle's Carlotta Rebella with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Vincent. North Korea has sent an elite army training delegation to Russia, heightening Western concerns about deepening military cooperation between the Asian neighbours. It's the first announced military exchange between the two nations since Russian President Vladimir Putin visited Pyongyang last month. The UK Parliament is sitting for the first time since last week's general election, with the election of a new Speaker of the House of Commons and the swearing-in of new MPs. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer will also attend before travelling to Washington for a summit of NATO leaders. And the US military have conducted a controversial parachute training exercise this year at Kadena Air Base in Japan's southernmost prefecture of Okinawa. The Okinawa government had repeated requests to halt practices deemed contrary to a Japan-US bilateral agreement, but the US military forged ahead with the drill. Those are today's headlines. Back to you, Vincent.
Thanks, Carlotta. Well, as just mentioned, NATO leaders are heading to Washington, D.C. for a conference to mark the alliance's 75th anniversary. Top of the agenda will be containing Russia, but other tensions, including China's behaviour in the Indo-Pacific region and towards Taiwan, are expected to be discussed. Chris Chermak, Monocle's senior news editor, joins me now from Washington, D.C. Chris, NATO's response so far to that dreadful bombing in Ukraine yesterday, what's it been?
Yeah, well, we have heard from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg on the attacks. He, of course, condemned the attacks like many others did, calling them heinous attacks on Ukraine. And I think it has really once again focused the attention, as your previous guest, Aliona, was talking about, on what NATO can do for Ukraine. And a key aspect of the responses you heard yesterday, both from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg and also from John Kirby in the U.S. with the White House, was this idea that Russia cannot outlast the West. This has been kind of the focus point, I think, also of the response to the attacks yesterday, to say this idea that you can continue attacking Ukraine because you believe that our will to defend Ukraine will die out. That is not going to happen. That is something that Russia should not be betting against. And that kind of goes to what this summit is going to be about, right? How can the allies here in the U.S. and in Europe, how can they enshrine their commitments to Ukraine in order to prove to Russia that there is no point in continuing this war and seeing that aid eventually, die away at some point in the future?
Now, yesterday, Jens Stoltenberg, the outgoing Secretary-General of the alliance, attended a baseball game and threw out the first pitch on what was dubbed NATO Day. It's a bit of a sign of NATO trying to reach out to the public. Why is it having to do this? Because it's one of these weird confluences where you go to the extreme left and the extreme right, and they are both quite sort of NATO critical, sceptical of NATO, say things like NATO provoked Russia. Are they having to do a lot more sort of disinformation battling than they've had to do in past?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's both disinformation and perhaps a little bit of tiredness, right? After 2.5 years of this war in the West, you are seeing the public shift a little bit. And then the question becomes sort of what should NATO do in different scenarios? There were, polls released by NATO itself ahead of this summit looking at sort of support for NATO in general. And yes, it's relatively high in most countries. Most countries do say, they will stay within NATO, but they don't necessarily consider it that hugely important. Here in the US, for example, only about 65% of Americans consider the alliance important to the future of their security. And it's some of those polling a little bit of a slip, if you will, in how some nations and how some publics see NATO that I think prompted something like what Jens Stoltenberg did yesterday. He went to the Nationals baseball game. He throws out the first pitch there. It's a big ceremonial thing that happens here in the United States. Usually it is more celebrities. Occasionally it is the leaders, Obama, other presidents have thrown out the first pitch at baseball games. It is incredibly rare to see a foreign dignitary of this kind of stature go through something like that. But they also played a montage of NATO's history, 75 years, the importance of the peace and security that it has brought to the United States, to the world, with various, speeches from different U.S. presidents. So really trying to make that link of how important NATO is for the United States as well. And yes, that goes to exactly this point of the need to kind of shore up this idea among the public as well, not just with, as I was mentioning, the statements earlier from, say, Stoltenberg and Kirby talking about long-term aid, but driving that home for the public in the West as well, and not just in Ukraine or Russia, to say we are in this for the long haul. This is something that the public should be accepting as well.
Should he also be doing things perhaps like the sort of late-night talk show circuit, or like the UN does, appointing kind of celebrity ambassadors to get that message out about supporting it?
Yeah, it's a fair point. I mean, some of these different things using influencers, different methods of also reaching younger people are happening to a degree. But yes, I do think this something like going to a baseball game is that sign, right? That Stoltenberg, he's also somebody who at this point, he's the outgoing NATO Secretary General. He has a little bit perhaps less to lose. So he's a little looser, you could almost say, at this summit in some ways, despite the gravity of the situation, in trying to kind of put himself in any situation he can find that is going to put NATO in the spotlight, essentially.
And what else are the leaders going to be talking about, and how under the spotlight is Joe Biden's performance going to be?
Yeah, so this is going to be the absolute top talking point, of course, Joe Biden. Before that, I should say, obviously, Ukraine is at the top, as I mentioned to begin with. One of the things Aliona was mentioning earlier, this idea of NATO membership for Ukraine. Jens Stoltenberg has talked about a bridge to NATO, and it's going to be key to see just what exactly that means, what kind of commitments Ukraine can get. Another aspect of this that's going to be discussed is China, as you mentioned as well, and particularly this idea of global partnerships. So you are seeing other leaders invited to this summit from South Korea, Australia, Japan, New Zealand. And this is sort of, I think, to the point of Russia and China trying to build up their alliances and their sort of counter alliances to the West. Stoltenberg and others have made the point that NATO is going to try and build their own version of that, a global partnership with other alliances, other countries. That's going to be a key aspect of this summit. And then, yes, absolutely, at the center of all of it will be Joe Biden, who will be giving a press conference on Thursday. He will be meeting with world leaders. He'll be meeting with Zelensky of Ukraine and others, meeting with Keir Starmer as well. And all eyes are going to be on how he performs. He cannot afford any missteps at this point. John Kirby of the White House yesterday said he has not had any signs from world leaders that they are concerned about Joe Biden. But, behind closed doors, you can only imagine that many many world leaders will be asking these sort of questions about Biden and whether he can really continue not just into the next, for the rest of this year, but whether he could do this for another 4 years or whether he decides to pass the torch to another candidate. That will absolutely be the key topic heading into his Thursday press conference.
Chris Chermak, thank you. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. You're back with The Briefing on Monocle Radio. It's time for a business news roundup, and I'm pleased to be joined now by Victoria Scholar, Head of Investment at Interactive Investor. Victoria, oil giant BP said it expects weak oil trading to hurt its second quarter earnings. Why is that?
Yes, that's right. The oil giant has been struggling with lower refining margins as well as weak oil trading, and it says that that's going to weigh on its second quarter results, like you say. It's expecting a hit of between $500 million and $700 million in its refining margins, and it's also expected to book an impairment charge of between $1 and $2 billion. That's linked to a write-down at an oil refinery in Germany. And this update from BP echoes what we heard from the US oil giant ExxonMobil earlier this week, that also warned about lower refining margins across the industry and softer natural gas prices that could weigh on its profits. And we're seeing that BP shares are trading down today, but also underlying oil prices have also come under pressure because of concerns about Hurricane Beryl that could weigh on US demand.
And turning now to Japan, and the Nikkei stock market index has hit a record high.
Yes, that's right. The Nikkei 225, its main equity benchmark index, has closed at a new all-time high above 41,000. That's been fueled by gains of computer chip stocks that's helped the index gain more than 2% in today's trade. The Nikkei took a long time to surpass its previous peak when it last hit a record high in 1989. In February, it did manage to briefly revisit those highs after 34 years. Now it's scaled those record highs once again. And this has been fueled by global investor hype around artificial intelligence companies that's helped spur demand for some tech companies in Japan. Also, the Japanese currency has been very weak, and that's supported some of the export-oriented stocks on the Nikkei. The yen is trading at its weakest levels in around 38 years.
And finally, tea drinkers might be upset to learn that prices are going up.
Yes, that's right. A tea crisis is brewing amid pressures on Indian harvests. We've seen disappointing weather conditions, a heat wave and floods that have hurt supply in India. This is according to India's tea board. Extreme weather has pushed up tea prices by 20% over the last year. And in May, India's tea production fell sharply by more than 30%, its lowest level in May for more than a decade, and that's hurt by heat and the lack of rainfall. Also, tea producers have been hit by higher costs because the government has decided to ban 20 pesticides, and that's pushed up the cost of production.
And I mean, are we talking about sort of all forms of tea here, or is this just sort of your classic builders?
Well, I think it probably could have a ripple effect across lots of different teas, but primarily we're talking about the classic tea that we think of, builder's tea.
All right. Victoria Scholar, thank you very much. You're listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. And finally, while several nations are experimenting with 4-day work weeks, Greece is bucking the trend, having introduced this month a 6-day working week for certain industries in a bid to boost economic growth. Well, I'm joined now from Athens by Evdoxia Limperi, UK correspondent for ERT, the Hellenic Broadcasting Corporation. Evdoxia, thank you for joining us. Firstly, can you explain how this will work?
Yes. Hi. The Greek law for a 6-day working week came in effect the 1st of July. Caused great concern, of course, to the Greek working people, but also reactions in the international press. Hundreds of social media users stressed that it is a Greek originality at a time when the global market and dozens of governments around the world are switching to the 4-day working week, and many commenting that this is a terribly negative development within the European Union. which has come to damage probably irreparably labor rights in the country. The Ministry of Labour and its Defence, I have to say, claimed that they proceeded to this legislation aiming mainly to support businesses that have difficulty finding staff for rotating shifts. The government's ambition is also to combat undeclared work, as many workers were already working 6 days without this being recorded in the Labour Inspectorate of the country, which is called Ergani system. The new measure comes with strict specifications, such as businesses that operate 24 hours a day, 7 days a week with rolling shifts, or 24 hours a day, 5 days a week with 5 to 6 days a week with rotating shifts again. The sixth day is coming with a 40% increase of the payment, which becomes 115% if it's a Sunday or the equivalent of a bank holiday in UK. The Minister of Labour, Mrs. Nikki Kerameos, spoke of fake news, and both her and the spokesperson of the government, Mr. Marinakis, made clear that the new regulation in no way concerns their entire labour market. And in order to apply for the 6-day scheme, there is a list of strict conditions which must be met by the businesses. On the other hand, though, there are, as I said, a lot of reaction. The syndicates speak of a backward-looking measure, and the opposition says that the government wants to take the country back to the Middle Ages. The General Confederation of Workers of Greece demands the immediate withdrawal of the measures until the adoption of the necessary ministerial decisions after a substantial dialogue with the new leadership of the ministry and representatives of workers and employers' organizations. Labour's advisors speak of a different reality, the reality that the government wants to make clear that it is, and that the government presents it. Said that the Labour advisor, Vasilis Prasas in particular, he spoke to a TV channel Mega the other day, because no one talks, he said, about the employees' right to deny. This is the little thing that everybody is, mad about. According to the law, the employee doesn't have the right to deny the work if their employer signs up to the scheme. And that's about the general idea about the 6th day. Yeah.
And so just to unpack a bit of that, I mean, in other nations, it's being shown that workers are more productive when they're actually on 4-day weeks. Of course, that doesn't work in all industries. But you touched on something there. Is this a problem, again, still of tax not being collected properly, of there being undercover work? Because we know when Greece was facing its huge crisis over a decade ago, there was a real problem in tax collection, wasn't there?
Tax collection, but also the workers' right. There is a lot of black market labor here. Many businesses don't declare the employees they have, or the government says that they want to combat this, they want to change this, they want to force the employers to record the number of the employees and how many hours they're working. But to be honest, the tourism and the hospitality industry doesn't have to. They don't fit into this scheme. There's only big industrial companies and stuff like that. And the industry, the tourism industry and the hospitality industry, which in Greece is massive, as you understand, they don't apply to this. And already many people work 6 days a week and many more than 8 hours a day. So it's a little bit, dark. It's a gray area. The people are spooked here. I came to Greece and everybody I have talked to, they are spooked about it. They are so, they think that it's their 5 days a week is threatened. So there is a lot of reaction. And to be honest, the government has taken aback a little bit. Because it's summer now, of course, it doesn't affect the industry of hospitality, as I said. So things are moving on, regularly there. There is a lot of public discussion, but a lot of fear and negative reactions from the people, from the workers here, I have to say.
And just to step back finally, I mean, Greece's economy from where it was, 12, 13 years ago has obviously strengthened. But now it's a bit of a success story, isn't it? And are you seeing after the sort of pandemic years now past that the tourism industry is now back to full force?
Oh, yes. I mean, the tourism at the moment is massive. The millions are expected again this year. A new record is going to be breaking this year. And now they're talking how to reduce a little bit the damage that we have seen that in Spain as well recently, if you notice, what happened in Barcelona.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. Well, people are becoming, a little bit aware of this here too, because in very popular islands like Santorini, Mykonos, Rhodes, there is, for example, in Santorini, there are so many cruise ships, these massive, gigantic, cruise ships.
Yeah.
And it's just becoming unsustainable. Yes, we are expecting millions again, a new record of tourists. The economy, as you said, has been stabilized. Still, the wages are not as good as as in other countries of Europe. People of course there is here as well the cost crisis, the cost of living crisis, energy crisis, you name it, and still the salaries are not to the level they should be. And after the European elections and the lower than expected percentages, the results that the government had in these elections, Mr. Mitsotakis, the Prime Minister, has been working on this to make Greek people, more to tackle the crisis of living costs, the cost of living crisis, and to increase the salaries in some ways. I don't know where and how, but he said he will. So we're expecting results.
Well, Evdoxia Limperi, thank you very much. And I should just say, in the new edition of Monocle magazine, the bumper July-August edition, which has hit newsstands, there are lots of travel tips for Greece this summer. Well, that is all for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Tom Webb and Laura Kramer. Our researchers were Sana Jumani and Gunnar Gronlid, and our studio manager was Flynn Simmons. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Vincent McAviney. Goodbye, and thank you for listening.